my name is Andy Thomas. I'm the author of several books about unexplained mysteries, but also 2 books about conspiracy theories. And my path really came from exploring unexplained mysteries like crop circles and UFOs, and then realizing there were other very serious areas where we weren't being told the truth. So, I became involved with people researching that. And as the years went by, I found that what would be helpful to people was to give some kind of overview, a context of what this all meant, because a lot of people hear bits and pieces. They find it hard to put it together. So, what I've tried to do over the years is try to put things into a coherent form so that you can encourage more research and more people who care about what's going on, that they can try to make a difference themselves. And so now I give lots of lectures and write books and just try to keep the word going out there. One of the things I find that is a problem in the alternative world, is that people, they use like a reference that they didn't actually check the reference that came before that. So often information goes round in a circle, but you never find what the original information was or where it came from. I always try to go outside of that. If you can find references going back to a source or, to a very definite starting place, then you can quickly see whether or not they are reliable. So when I'm looking at something, say, to write about it, I will always do really 2 things. The first thing I would do is go to an absolute believer's site, a conspiracy theory, the full extreme view. Then I will try and find one that debunks it, that says it's not true. And then as a final third thing, I will look in the middle, try and find, if it's possible, some kind of middle ground. And you can pretty quickly see from that where the truth lies. And, if a middle ground source still admits there's something going on, like, say, Wikipedia, which can be very dismissive of alternative views, but just occasionally, even they cannot fully debunk something. And that, I think, is always interesting. So if you can, triangulate an opinion, you can then get a more solid ground to say, this is worth talking about, this is worth writing about, and then try to look as objectively as possible at that information and not load it with too much opinion. There's too much opinion out there instead of research-based information. So I try to make it based in something and give as many references as possible so people can go away and actually look at it themselves and see the truth of it for themselves, because you can never be told what to believe. You can only be offered an alternative view that they themselves can then discover for themselves. One of the interesting areas to go into is the history of how conspiracy theories have developed over the years. And what you very quickly realize is that there are repeating patterns. We think this is all new, the way people talk about conspiracy theory. It isn't. I mean, you can go back literally to the Greek times to find the same kinds of accusations going on of state-sponsored terrorism or whatever it may be. The Roman Empire is a very good source for that. And I always think the symbol of Nero playing music while Rome burned is a classic example of that's really the encapsulation of conspiracy theory. A leader seemingly not caring about his own people, seemingly responsible for the very terrible thing that's happening, and doing it so that he can blame others. This is the essence of conspiracy theory, really. It's about power, money, and basically influence, to give a lot of influence to the few over the many by nefarious means. And you can find so many ancient examples of that, and then you can come through virtually every century in history and find the same thing going on. If you go to the Tudor times, Elizabethan times, you've got, again, so many plots and conspiracies and counter-plots and counter-conspiracies going on, but it's the same thing. And if you just take something like the Gunpowder Plot, very famous, Guy Fawkes and all of that. On the surface, it seems like a group of Catholics trying to blow up the Protestant king and the Parliament. But at the time, it was very widely believed that they had been fooled, tricked into being part of that plot, deliberately, so further persecution of Catholics could take place. And certainly that was widely believed at the time, in the same way today. Many people widely believe 9/11 was an inside job. But we think this is kind of a new way to think, and it isn't. And you can go right back, and any century you pick, you will find another example. But I think we are encouraged to forget the historical examples, because then it's easy to ridicule it and say something like this could never happen, because it has never happened. Well, of course, when you look and find that it's always been happening, the odds are that it's still happening today, which, of course, it's very clear that that is the case in so many areas. One interesting area to go into is to choose something that people are very familiar with. And, when you're used to conspiracy theories, you get sort of basically very blasé about accepting things that people on the outside would find very extreme, very shocking. And therefore, one of the things that I like to spend a little bit more time on is the moon landings. Because it's something, many people hold this up as evidence of mankind's greatest achievement. And yet, the fact is, of course, there are many conspiracy theories around it. And at first glance, they sound ridiculous until you start to look at the evidence. Now, I would never say we didn't go to the moon. I don't say that. But when you look at the evidence, you can absolutely show some of it has been fabricated. Certainly the photographs are very suspicious in terms of their lighting conditions and angles, and you can go on and on. And although this is made fun of in the mainstream media, when you actually look at the evidence, you realise we have not been told the whole truth about the moon landings. Now that's a very good one to show to people on the outside, because they all know about the moon landings and they think they know the whole story. And yet, when you show them such obvious anomalies in things like the photographs, it doesn't take long to make people realise that maybe there's another side to this they didn't know about. Now, what that means is anybody's guess. A lot of people think we did go. The photographs didn't come out, something went wrong, they had to show the world that something had happened. Others, of course, think that what they found they couldn't show. Some believe there were extraterrestrial bases on the moon, whatever it is. And, of course, you've got the hardcore that believe absolutely that we didn't go. But people must make up their own minds about that. But you can certainly give them enough to say, go away and reevaluate it. And another good example would be 9/11. Now, in the conspiracy world, that's almost now so deeply ingrained, you don't need to say too much about it. And in my presentation today, I won't go into that in too great a detail because, and this is, I think, an incredible strength, so many people are already aware of the issues around 9/11. And anybody that believes the official story of that has never looked at the evidence, which simply does not match up with what we are told occurred for numerous reasons. And I think it's very encouraging in a way that, when they had the poll on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, around the world there were various polls taken as to what people believed about it. Around 50% of the world's population no longer believes the official story of 9/11. Now, they may have variations in what they believe in among that, but nonetheless, that's quite astonishing. Because it means that we are all at heart conspiracy theorists, a large percent of the population. And in fact, if you want a better example, if you interview British people, around 90% of people, for instance, believe that Princess Diana was assassinated, no matter what the inquests say. Dr. David Kelly, the UN weapons inspector, who said there were no weapons of mass destruction, who then died in very mysterious circumstances. Well, you won't find many people in Britain who believe he committed suicide, which is, of course, the official view. Again, very similar poll, around 90% of people believe he was murdered. So, although the mainstream media make fun of people who apparently have extreme and unusual views, they are presenting a fake facade, because very often, in fact, it's the majority of people who do believe the conspiracy theories. And okay, that doesn't immediately mean they're true, but I think you can gauge certainly the unreliability of official evidence when you look at polls like that. So I will be concentrating on some of those areas too, because again, Dr. David Kelly, Princess Diana, they're things people feel they know something about because they were very mainstream, but often you will find people don't really know the nuts and bolts of why people doubt it. And I will be saying a little bit more about that in my presentation today. I mean, I have an interest in what some people would call paranormal phenomena. And it really began for me with looking at crop circles. I was down in the West Country of England, in Wiltshire, in the early 1990s, and there they were, crop circles on every horizon. And I was immediately fascinated and I wanted to know more, and not one person could tell me where they came from or what was going on. And despite the newspapers deciding in 1991 in particular that it was all made by people with bits of wood and pieces of string, which is still what we're told today, I found myself, even in those early years, that the evidence just didn't match up with that for some formations. Everybody accepts some are man-made, maybe even many. But to say that all of them are man-made really doesn't take the evidence into account. And I was immediately fascinated with the tales. I would hear firsthand of strange lights seen coming down from the sky, people who've witnessed them appearing within seconds. You've got biological anomalies occurring within the circle-flattened crop, things that just cannot be easily explained. And then I, myself, in 1993, with a group of colleagues, witnessed the balls of light that many people see over crop circles. So I've seen that. I don't need anybody to try to debunk it. I don't know what they were, but I know they were there. So that made me think, yeah, there is another side to this that isn't being represented. And I think that's true for a lot of other things like ghost research, UFOs. There are things that the media traditionally dismisses, brushes it aside, hallucination, or just fantasies, or, people being fooled easily. That isn't the case when you look at the evidence. It was through my interest in unexplained mysteries that, of course, I became more and more involved with people exploring anything and everything. And, then I became aware of the more conspiracy-based things, and I was drawn to it because I could see myself that just something as simple and as beautiful and as harmless as a crop circle, how badly misrepresented that they were in the media. I thought, well, you can absolutely guarantee that all these other bigger areas must be even more misrepresented, as indeed is clearly the case. So, I became fascinated with not only finding out about it, but sharing it with others. Because the more people that know that there are cases to be answered, the more you're going to stand a chance of actually overturning this fake facade that we have in the mainstream that says that only this, and this are true, and all this over here is nonsense. And you just realise that isn't the case at all. At the very least, it needs to be heard, it needs to be looked at, and the evidence sifted. This foolish mainstream approach we have of not even engaging with the evidence, I think, is one of the worst things. And that is why you get conspiracy theories, of course, that are even more extreme than maybe the ones that are very provable, because people are used now to not being taken seriously. And so the moment they're told to believe something, they will not believe it, because they realise that so many things have been badly handled in the past. And that's the problem. And then you get sort of people not knowing what to believe about anything. So as much as possible, I try to focus that, give a context to why people question everything, give the history of it, but most of all to say there is evidence for some areas that's very strong. Doesn't mean that every conspiracy theory ever is true, but certainly some of them you can absolutely say there's a really good case to be answered. And I just try to share that to encourage discussion in the hope that if enough people wake up, they can overturn what is clearly a very bad situation at the moment, where nobody trusts the governments don't trust the people, and clearly we're being abused, and clearly we're being suppressed, on whatever level you think that's taking place. And, you can argue about that. Maybe it's not quite as bad as some say, but equally it's certainly worse than others say when people say there's nothing going on. There's always a truth in the middle, but people have to make up their own minds. So I try as much as possible to share with people enough information that they can go away and make up their own minds. And I will often address alternative groups like here today there will be many people who are already of this mind, but I'm lucky enough to be on a circuit of speaking where I will often address people who are not used to this information, but they're curious to hear it. And that's really nice, because you really are bringing this to people very often for the first time. And you can't overload people. You cannot tell them, you must believe this. That just won't work. But you can offer it as a possibility and say, this is why I believe it, and here's the evidence. And you'll find usually very quickly people will open up and say, I never knew that. That's extraordinary. I must find out more. And if you can set those dominoes tipping and get more and more people talking about this, that's going to stand the best chance of all of the world changing for the better, which clearly it needs to.